Great. So welcome. On today's show, we have Tim Schmitz, who studied at ESADE and then went out to create Jodel, a very popular location-based communication app that's especially popular with students over here in Europe and beyond. So we'll learn about that. Tim, so exciting to have you today.
Pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
Tim, tell us a bit, what was your personal story in the entrepreneurship domain? How did you come about being the co-founder of Jodel?
I guess it was a bit random. I mean, it wasn't like I had the biggest dream of founding something when I was in school. But yeah, I studied my bachelor in Germany, did my experience in banking and consulting, like most business students. During my master, when I was at ESADE and also in Australia, the question was a little bit obviously what I want to do after, and I had already let's say stronger ties to software development because my dad owns a software company, and I had already coded for him quite like some apps during my studies. And then my friend who I met in my exchange semester during my bachelor, Alessio, who had founded another app called Telem, after he came back in the days, he approached me in my last year of my studies, and he wanted to iterate it to something else, and whether I would be willing to join. And then I had the decision whether I want to do now banking or consulting again, which I didn't, or join this app called Jodel with a couple of beta users back at the time. And I did join, and we iterated together to what is Jodel today, and that was pretty much it.
Was it a hard decision to go for this crazy project called Jodel when you have a degree from one of the best business schools over here in Europe, or everything set up to be like in the finance, will be some big investment banker, kind of, that's one track, and then here comes your friend and says, hey, let's build a social networking app, a location-based social networking app, but we're close to 0 users. And so how did you think about making that jump?
So I mean, obviously it wasn't like, of course it's this one or the other one, but ultimately I had decided for myself already previously in my life that in the future I will base most of my decisions based on the people that I work with and the people that I will be surrounded with, and not just where there's the most money or most status. My dad also, he, let's say, enforced me in that decision, because obviously he also founded the company himself. And I guess, then the decision was kind of clear for me. And obviously, I think like it's the best time to do it just after your studies, because, when you already did banking for a while or you did consulting for a while, let's say, step back is a lot more significant. If you're a student, you don't need a lot of money to survive, let's say. And then like a yearly salary of 25K is okay, because, well, it's more than you had as a student, right? So you don't really have to adjust your living situation. Whereas if you have earned more than 100K and then you go back to something like that, obviously that's once you go with the taxi to the airport, I don't think you go back to taking the tram and reduce your salary, right? So the step is, I think, a lot easier than once you actually do start to study. So retrospect, I think it was a good decision and also the right time for it.
What gave you the confidence that Jodel could work, especially when you saw that Telem initially was struggling quite a bit?
I don't think I had very the biggest confidence, let's say, but I mean, ultimately what could go, I was more asking myself the question, what could go wrong? I mean, if this goes wrong, then, well, I look for another job or I do something else, right? Because there's literally 0 risk after you finish your studies, because, well, all of us, we're not going to be unemployed, right? So it was more like I didn't see any risk, but obviously a potential upside. And that's why I went for it.
Did you thought about hey, let's try it out for a year, or is it certain milestones when you talked about that you wanted to hit in a certain time frame or so? We said, hey, we want to test out this, and if this works, then we kind of take it to the next level, or was it just like, hey, let's see and let's go?
So I don't really like plan too long in these terms, right? So I usually plan for the next 3 months, because everything after that is is usually not plannable anyways. So I didn't really have specific milestones, but obviously, like after I joined, we launched it, we iterated, we saw first communities actually popping up that did work, which obviously gives you like a product validation. Then it was more about scaling that, and then we actually managed to scale that. So like the next step always happened naturally, and like I did feel like we progressed, or I do feel like we progressed. I didn't have clear milestones, like I want to, in 1 year I want to be there, in 6 months I want to be there. But let's say naturally, definitely, obviously, if it would have felt like we're not progressing, then obviously at some point I would have probably taken a different decision. But that question never was posed to myself, because so far we've always been able to progress in the right direction, let's say.
Uh-huh. For people that think about launching, let's say, social networks or location-based networks, especially in the consumer space where they need size as well, what would you think is a good heuristics to think about the minimal viable product or the first thing kind of to launch? What would they need early on?
So ultimately, what you look at, obviously, always in especially consumer apps, and any product, but consumer apps, obviously, this is quite vital to even reach a critical mass, is retention. So basically, if a person downloads the app, how many people are gonna use it within the next 1, 3, 7, 30, 180 days? And or how many percentage of these that register, right? Because obviously, if your retention is 1% after day 30, well, that means you just lost 99% of your users, and then obviously it's hard to create a critical mass, because this critical mass is always what you need in consumer products. Whereas if it's like north of 20%, which is actually a very good value, then well, there is a sign, and usually like the one thing is what users say, and then the other thing is what users do. So Talon, that was launched in the US back in the days, there were like many, let's say, extrinsic motivations that unless you back then had tried to make people download this app, right? So get your fraternity on board and you get a free PlayStation, etc. And everybody was saying, well, this app is great, everybody loves it. But then, in the stats, you could see that after day 3, nobody's using this app anymore. And then obviously you can put in as many downloads as you want. This is not going to work. And then you could also see that only by these externalities, let's say, foster downloads, they're like just people, they didn't continue to use it. And so the one thing is what people obviously say, and also tell them, everybody said, this is great. I mean, obviously it was launched in California. Everybody says everything is great there. So, but then, in the stats, you could really see that like after day 3, this app wasn't being used. And then obviously that's product market fit, right? Then that means that there is no product market fit. What you're looking for is an asymptote with like good retention. And the first app wasn't like that. And when we then launched Jodel in Aachen, it was the first community we had like the craziest retention our investors had ever seen, right? So then at some point, you might not have many users, but you do have a cohort of users that stick around for a very long time. And then obviously, that there's something, and then the next step would be finding out what this something is, whether it's the hypothesis you had at the beginning or whether it might be something completely different. But once you have that means you have product market fit, and then it's just a question of how to scale that to more users.
Mm-hmm. And they're very interesting. And to share metrics as well, you said 20% would be very high. What would be like metrics that are okay-ish then, also where you say there could be something there? Is it somebody has 5% 30-day retention, so users staying around for 30 days? Is that something to work with? Is that normal?
So the average in the App Store is like between 1 and 3%, I think, day 30 retention. Like I think that's the average Android app. And the rest, I mean, it depends on which app you're talking about, right? So consumer social usually is optimized. I mean, what you're trying to find also is your usage interval, right? So if you have your usage interval like social, which should be daily, like you should be checking Instagram daily, you should be checking WhatsApp daily, you should be checking Jodel daily, then obviously you optimize for daily retention. But for example, for Airbnb, it doesn't make sense to look at day 30 retention because well, they don't optimize for that, right? So they are happy if you come once a month and do a booking, but not if you're there specifically on day 30. So for consumers, so it depends on the industry. For consumer social, like everything north of 20% is great. We started at the very beginning with like north of 40%. So like really high, which is like, so the most social apps will be between 20 and 30%. But yeah.
And that's for a really well working app. And you said many apps in the App Store that have been around for years and optimized, and so they still stick around maybe 2-3% or so, or have retention rates of 2 to 3%.
I mean, social apps will not survive with these retention apps because, again, like you have to have critical mass, and then if you have just 2 to 3% retention, then you're not going to gain that. Obviously, for let's say diamond selling app, 2 to 3% day 30 retention, I guess is quite good because it probably means that 2 to 3% are going to buy your diamonds and you make a lot of money. But again, consumer social is a mass market product, and that's why also here the retention rates are different, right? So it depends on your product, right? So Airbnb will probably more optimize towards, I don't know, month 3 retention instead of day 30. And Spotify maybe just towards week 12, because they might not be optimizing on a daily use case and not on a monthly, but a weekly one, right? So there's like, it depends on the product usage interval, it depends on the product, but yeah, consumer social, like north of 20% is usually the goal.
Super exciting, and I think extremely helpful as well. Let's assume that no people see that happening, and actually, let's say around about 20% of users seem to be active after 30 days. How much more can you lose than over, let's say, after 6 months, 12 months or so? Is it, how far can this asymptote basically go down then, would you say? Is it, at that point, will you, after 30 days, lose another 50% or so? What are some benchmark figures there? Like the long-term kind of retention?
I think it's hard to say because like there's actually usually no public data about that, just approximations. So ultimately it doesn't really, like, what is important is that there's an asymptote, right? Because if there's an asymptote, that means if it's flat, that this, what is flat, like this is your product market fit. This is your, let's say, addressable market if you want, right? Because these people, they will stick around. And
for
then
this percentage of people, no, exactly.
Yeah, and this might be different, right? So for us, it flattens out. I don't even know, like, but I've like, you lose 80% of the users that you lose within the first 2-3 days, right? So like if your day 1 retention will already be at like, I don't know, 60-70% maybe. So you see that like at the beginning you lose a lot, and then like it flattens out, and then these people, they will stick around. So then after that, you don't really lose anymore. The asymptote is flat. And yeah, again, this is like different for different products. But like, yeah, for us, I think after 30 days, like it's already almost pretty much flat. So, and I think that's probably for most products. I don't have enough insights to say that, but yeah, it's an asymptote, which means that over time you lose less and less people, and at best case it's flat. And the really great products, it even goes up again.
What makes it go up again? The famous the retention curve that starts to smile, no, form the smile out there.
Yeah, so best use case maybe. I mean, like ultimately that means network effects, right? You install this app and then you think, oh, I don't need it, but then all your friends start using it, and because they all use it, you think, oh, now I also have to use it, and people will start to use it again. So for me, maybe Snapchat was like that at the beginning. You install Snapchat, you think, oh, this is, I don't need this. I already have like all these other apps. And then over time, like, you don't use it, but then slowly but steadily more and more friends are using it. And because they send you snaps, it makes your activity go up actually. So that's network effects, which are then the ultimately strongest ones. Then came Instagram, so all this I think didn't work out back then. But yeah, ultimately these are the retentions that, like, if you have those, then you have a great product.
So one could think as well, if I lose then these 80% of people, wouldn't I then just be way more targeted in my user acquisition and just try to understand who are, let's say, the 20% that stick around, that are really my core users, and just go for those, and hence as well get better percentage-wise retention metrics over time?
Just I mean, your first goal would be rather invest in product development, right? So the product development, which is what are these 20% of the people that stick around doing in the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sessions that the other 80% are not doing, and can we lift the asymptote, right? So can this asymptote go up from 20 to 30%? And then, for example, I mean, I don't know if it's true, but like the most commonly used example there is usually Facebook. They found out that the people that stick around, they were all like, they made like a benchmark, like like a proxy. So basically they found out that these people that stick around, if you have had like 10 friends in the first 7 days of your usage, like your likelihood of churning is pretty much 0. So these people that stick around after 30 days, they had done that, the other one not. Probably you could have also done 3 in 1 day or 5 in 2, I don't know, just some kind of proxy. Then they optimize everything towards that in the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sessions of users. So they made it more prominent to add people. They made a better algorithm to suggest better people to you that you add, etc. And with that, they lifted the retention, right? So that's usually what you try to do with product development. And in your acquisition, well, yes, also obviously you're trying to always optimize not for a download, because if I just make everybody download this, it doesn't mean that they will continue to use it over time. But by now, all these, let's say, attribution trackers, like what you optimize for is not a user who downloads your app, but a user who uses your app after 30 days or who uses your app after 7 days. Obviously, this comes with some disadvantages because only after 30 days, you know whether this was successful. So usually you try to find for early signs in the funnel. Let's say if you do 5 comments on your first day and the likelihood that these people will stay after 30 days, then you will probably rather optimize for people that in their first session do 5 comments, because you know they're probably going to stick around and you have earlier data points in order to, let's say whether this acquisition was successful or not.
Mm-hmm. Super interesting. With how many people were you programming the app then? Is there like some advice or that? Do you need like, is it okay to try to start it with 2, 3 kind of developers? Would you need more?
I mean, at the beginning, obviously, like you should develop the MVP, so the minimum. So I think you should not hire too many engineers, but like really keep it to the basics and see whether the basics works. And then you don't need all these crazy features that you're thinking about right now, right? Probably you just need one feature that works and make this the core of your app. And then after that, you can optimize with all these great features. But yeah, I mean, we started with, pretty much, I mean, one Android, one iOS, one backend, I guess. This is what you need nowadays. Now we are, again, like mobile only with high usage. So for us, native development made sense. By now, there's actually a couple of frameworks with which you can do like cross-platform. So you might actually only need one developer. But yeah, I mean, at the beginning, obviously, it's important to start simple, test the hypothesis you have, and really make sure that you find what's the core of the value proposition you have and figure out whether that works. And if that works, then you can still iterate and like make all this nicer. But I think at the beginning, if you invest too much, then you lose a lot of money without even validating whether this is going to work or not.
Mm-hmm. Super exciting. How long did it take you to actually launch it then, to put that first version out there?
The first version was, I mean, tell them back in the days when I wasn't even there. I don't have exact info how long this took, but then like basically we developed Jodel out of that, which was a bit of a problem also technical wise, because we had to, like the first app,
I imagine that, yeah.
like, it wasn't at all thought for location. It was more like for friends graph, let's say authentic communication among friends. And then obviously if you try to pull over like a location-based communication over it, then this becomes a mess. So we had to refactor like afterwards quite some times. But like ultimately at the beginning was very hacky. And then, yeah, I think the decision to iterate this to Jodel and how this should look like was maybe like 3 months, something around that, the iteration, right?
Mm.
But sometimes it's actually easier to build it from ground up. So I don't think it's actually, I mean, ultimately, MVPs, right? So you should not invest too much time, because if you invest too much time, then the likelihood of this going wrong, or like your costs, let's say, that you invest in the wrong features might be a lot bigger, rather than developing the first version and then testing it out with users and see.
Now you said, hey, we have this scrappy version, we have this team working on that can optimize it then further. How did you launch it?
So basically, because like the previous app had already burned quite some money, let's say again, there were like so many acquisition thoughts, right? So from get your fraternity a PlayStation if you have the most downloads of the campus, to merchandise like beach wear, I don't know what, to convincing the taco guy on campus to make tell him taco, right? To like obviously all these things, they they were quite expensive. Even flying to the US, buying all this merch, etc. So basically, we just didn't have any more money, and then we were thinking, okay, what can we do now? Well, we have to launch in Germany because we can't fly back to the US again. And then how can we launch? Well, the only thing that we can actually afford is flyers. And then we just printed some flyers, distributed them in the campus, and then figured out that this is actually a very valid channel for us, right? So again, here I think everybody needs to have their own strategy. There is the mobile growth stack, which I like a lot, which is from the SoundCloud people, that shows you all channels through which you can grow a mobile app. And our channel wasn't actually on there.
the flyers to students. Yeah.
I don't think any app has ever grown with flyers, but for us it was very effective because we could launch our target demographic like on the ground in the right spot, which is in the lecture, in the morning when they were trying to procrastinate, right? And then like downloading an app because they had Wi-Fi, because they are in the university, right? So we could target them at just the right spot. So for us it worked, but probably for most apps it won't. So I think it's important to just have a strategy around that. And for us, I guess it was a bit lucky also because, it was, the only money we had left was basically that we could afford was basically flyers. But then over time, we actually realized this actually works very well, and we can even optimize it quite heavily. And ultimately, the last time nowadays we have done marketing was distributing flyers in 2016. And this, definitely was very effective for us.
Were you strategic about like which type of studies, which gender or something to focus on, which university even to choose? Or
I mean, obviously a bit at the beginning, but then we definitely, like, once we realized, oh, this works, we definitely got very, very, let's say, tactical about it, right? So where exactly do we had like real-time charts where we could really see when we distribute flyers, how many downloads arise. We the content within the first 2-3 days, we pushed content in the communities, right? And we took the content that was shared a lot, that was upvoted a lot in other communities. We localized that, right? So if there was this post, I just went to club, and then club we just localized to every city because we realized that this was creating a lot of engagement. There was a lot of I mean, we saw that when girls are there, guys are usually not too far. So like girly content usually worked very well. Then the promoter who put the flyers, he went in the lessons, in the classes, and then yodeled about these classes, and then put like flyers all over, because then the first person would download, see content about just that exact same lecture where that person was sitting in, left, right. And then usually after these lectures, we had like 80% of the people there as new users. And many of these things, it was very important to always be, because we're also community based, to rather penetrate like a small community very heavily rather than a bigger community to a lower extent. So when we had 80% of the first year business students, let's say, it would grow organically to the second year business students, to the first year sociology students, etc. But once we had 5% of the whole university, it was like the organic growth was less because we didn't have as much of a penetration. So definitely we got very, let's say, sophisticated about it, and have up until today quite some tricks of how we did it. But ultimately, I think this is like, I mean, every app will grow differently, right? So this approach will probably not work for Airbnb or something like that. I don't know.
But there are various exciting ventures I know that are focused on universities, and so I think this is extremely helpful for people who want to make it real in the university space and start apps there. I think there's still a lot that needs to be built. Do you want to tell us a bit where you currently stand in terms of, so you've been building Jodel out, you had a lot of success actually in this space. Now tell us a bit what where Jodel currently stands.
So what we did was, let's say after we launched a couple of more countries because we figured, oh, this works. Then we saw first countries which like were, let's say, flattening out, right? So that were growing, and then at some point like stalling at like good levels, but still obviously what our mission was always to what means always, like what happened after we had this like we saw first countries that were stabilizing on like higher levels. What we did was we went back to the, let's say, to the engine room to find out exactly what was happening, what the dynamics, because at the beginning when you grow, and it does grow, sometimes you don't even know why it's growing, right? So it's important to actually understand that. So we digged very deep into what our product actually should be all about, what's the core value, etc. Because at the beginning we had troubles to understand even why is this growing now, whereas the other app wasn't growing, and whereas Telegram was still anonymous communication with your friends, let's say. The first MVP Jodel was then anonymous communication with people nearby. And then we really digged into the product because like media and investors, they were saying, oh, you're a joke platform, because there was a lot of funny content. But we were always saying, yeah, there's a lot of jokes, but it's not only that. There's a couple of things different, but we couldn't really explain it. And then we dig very deeply into the data, and we saw that the things that correlate basically mostly with retention was events that we weren't even triggering before. So it's basically clicking on a post to scroll through and actively communicate within a conversation, which makes it very different compared to an app where you just scroll and upvote. So let's say this would be more of a joke platform where it's clicking on a post and then reading through the whole conversation. We really realized that this was by far the most used interaction. It was 90% compared to the voting, just 50%. And also we figured that this correlates mostly with retention. So you could really interpret the difference compared to like, hey, you're a joke platform, to hey, you're a platform for communication or conversations with people nearby. And yes, there might also be funny things, but also definitely other things. And then we, digged quite deep, understood a lot more about the product, understood how we grew, why we grew, why at some point we stopped growing, went back to the products. Let's say we iterated it quite heavily, made some features, quite some bold bets. So back in the days, then basically the question was, should we now become a global app for students, or should we become what we actually wanted to do, which is solving local communication for everyone, right? Because we also believe my grandma should use this app to know what's around. And this was always our goal, which is definitely more complicated, but also more rewarding. We iterated the product quite heavily, which is basically reiterating the product market fit, right? So it, like, once you have product market fit, it doesn't mean you have it forever, but you obviously need to constantly adjust it. And yeah, started launching new markets with the iterated product, and now we actually see first countries where we grow like super deep, like 35% of all 18 to 35-year-olds using Jodel in first markets.
Wow, that's impressive. 35% of the population, huh? In a certain age group.
18, yeah, so it's roughly like 7% of the population in first markets. Yeah. So there we really
that's impressive. Yeah.
We really saw what we can actually achieve. And yeah, in the meantime, obviously you have to make sure that you don't die. So we had to obviously also invest quite some time on monetization, which we do now quite successfully. And now basically our plan is to replicate what we do in these markets where we iterated the product correctly in all our existing markets, and then together with the monetization engine that we have built, take the next step in regards to growth.
Mm-hmm. Super exciting. When you talked about as well learning and trying to figure out why certain effects happen, we learned a lot about retention. What would you, which advice would you give founders? What's the best way to learn? We heard looking at data correlation analysis between core metrics as well, making sure that you have the core metrics actually tracked, and so. Other suggestions that are really important early on to find out why are users doing something in the consumer app space?
I mean, it's a variety of things. It's not only data, but obviously I always think that the data is the truth, and then everything else you can interpret around it. But I mean, talking to many users, right? And also you can make user interviews quantifiable, right? So there's like frameworks if you just or different surveys, right? What do you think is the core value of this? Like Sean Ellis framework is, for example, one of this. But obviously, like speaking to a lot of users, also like a huge, like large part is also product gut feeling. So definitely, we also did make some quite bold bets where our intuition was saying, look, this is what has to happen. And we had singular data points that pointed us towards this direction or that direction or that direction. But it's not always like, oh, that's the solution. This is in the data. This is the root. But sometimes like it's not as clear because you also never know whether it's the cause or correlation, right? So there's a few of these topics that are not so simple. So there's definitely also the third part is a big chunk of product gut feeling and product intuition. Because definitely could have been like different solutions if you look at the data, but ultimately it also comes down to your own experience and what you believe must happen. So yeah, I guess looking at the data, speaking to a lot of users, and last but not least, product intuition.
Mm-hmm. How many users, for example, just to give some benchmark figures there, were you talking to then? Was it that you said per week, I want to talk at least to 5 to 10 users or something like that? Or was it just like, we have some people dedicated to that?
I mean, speaking to users is obviously the one thing. And yeah, I mean, this doesn't scale so well. So obviously you have to do it often, but you can also like make this more, let's say, yeah, in different ways, let's say, right? So there's, for example, on Jodel, if you post something with hashtag feedback, it goes into a Slack channel with a bot. So we see everything, a single post that has a hashtag feedback. We obviously we do regular AMAs where we, let's say, talk with the community about it. We do, what else? Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of surveys. I mean, surveys is like, let's say, something that you can scale a little bit better, get more insights, but then like it doesn't take as much time because obviously you can talk to 100 users every single week. So I think it's a combination of it, and I don't think there's like this one number that you have to talk to. But I just think in general, being close to the users, whether this is through automated feedback messages or direct conversations, etc. I think that's what everybody should figure out for themselves. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating to see, how being really close to the users, you build this really high retention metrics now in certain demographics. What's next for Jodel? What are you most excited about?
I mean, ultimately, we've now seen that Jodel can be a mass market product in markets if we launch it correctly with the right features. And our next step is now to replicate that in even more markets, also in some of the existing markets where we are active and we have users and we have good amount of users, but we don't see the penetration levels of these first markets now that we launched with these product iterations. And our step right now is basically reproducing that in all our markets, because then we would be already fucking huge. And at the same time, focus on also monetization, because ultimately it's always nicer if you also make some money and don't just burn through it. And yeah, it just makes you less dependent on investors. So this loop, let's say, is the one that we're trying to create now. So let's say make money and then invest that money in growth, with which you then invest, make more money again, etc. Yeah, I mean, so far we are not, let's say, profitable, so we are not at the stage yet that we would invest the money that we actually earn into our growth. It's more like making sure that we burn through less money. But yeah, ultimately the elephant in the room is make sure to replicate that growth that we've seen in first countries.
Mm-hmm. What for you personally is the most exciting? What do you enjoy most?
You mean what I enjoy most working on?
Working at Jodel now, how many years have you been there now, building and growing Jodel?
Almost like 6, yeah.
6 years in, so what do you enjoy most?
I mean, I enjoy the variety, definitely. So I mean, there's nothing I haven't been doing at Jodel. So at the beginning, I focused mostly on growth, then on fundraising, then I built up the moderation system, community, product, tech, pretty much everything. By now, I'm most excited about product, I guess. So, but hands-on, like developing the product, making the right, like making feature decisions, building these features, building them nicely, iterating on them, etc. One part within that I'm excited about is in-app purchases. We've recently started also with let's say like making features with like in-app purchases, and it's a huge market. More and more people do it. In Germany, it's still a little bit let's say, oh, you just paid 99 cents for this, whereas in other countries they just like spend there. I think it's an exciting trend because also most platforms, they move away from an ads-based monetization model, which is value decreasing, right? Because every time I show you an ad, I could as well just show you a good post right now, to value enhancing features. So basically features that make you money and that increase the engagement on the platform. And usually most of the in-app purchases are like that. And I think that's a phenomenon what we see on quite some, like first platforms are adopting it. We're still not the first, but also still in the first batch of, let's say, platforms that are adopting it. And I think it's exciting because it's one of the, let's say, huge market opportunities that is growing so much, especially now with the lockdown time where people are spending even like a lot more in different apps. And by now people do spend in apps, right? So back in the days, if you had bought an app for 99 cents, everybody thought you would be crazy, but now it becomes more and more normal, even if in Germany it's not so normal yet, but I think we're getting there.
Fantastic. It shows as well no new opportunities for people thinking, what should I do here? We see the market, really the online market, are quickly evolving, and in all this monetization space and in app space, I'm sure as well many new tools and so etc. are needed, and new apps can be built. Any final advice for people who are thinking about making it real?
Final advice. Yeah, I mean, I think I already said quite some things, but for me, I can only speak for myself. I think the situation like after the studies was just very good because again, you don't need this 200K salary in your first year after studies. Could as well just continue to live like a student and just do some fun things. So I think that's important. I don't think, yeah, I feel sometimes like people are being pushed a little bit in that direction, and now it's into found something or whatever. Like, you know, it obviously has its perks, but it also like has some drawbacks, right? So obviously, like the compensation, or like at least cash compensation at the beginning usually is rather low, right? So make sure that you actually want to do what you're doing there. But also like stress levels are obviously higher than in a general let's say job. You know, there is the ups that you always hear about in the media, but there's also quite some downs, right? And you definitely have to be resilient to stand through that, and it might not be for everyone, but yeah, just look at this situation. Not only like you hear a lot from the perks and yeah, founding now it's in and whatever, but yeah, I don't think maybe it's not for everyone. That's okay, right? Just find your decision-making framework that suits you, and if that decision-making framework tells you, well, you should work in a bank, then that's just as good. But yeah, final advice: just make sure that the decision you take, like they are coming from you and your own preferences, and not from like what others tell you. And if that's founding, that's good. Obviously, it has huge perks. You can build the company you want to. You have a lot of flexibility, freedom. You do. It's not really a job. Like I always say, I'm just hanging out with friends and doing this cool project. So it's not like you actually feel like this is a job. So all of these are obviously huge perks, but then there's many things that you don't hear about. So sometimes things go to shit, and yeah, you also have to go through these times, and then make sure that your desire to do all this is actually big enough to go through these times as well.
Do you have any final advice for people that go through dark times when they feel like, oh my God, no, it's all about retention now, I don't see that retention kicking in, and you're in this emotional state almost like of desperation or so?
I mean, what's very important is that everybody who's trying to build a product the likelihood, the first idea you have, you build this product and you have great retention, goes towards zero. So I don't think
no?
this ever happens. I mean, maybe some, but then this is definitely an outlier. Mostly you launch it, you realize, oh, this doesn't work. And then it's about, yeah, I mean, the iterations and finding what works, right? So our company was going through the same. So this was launched, and after day 3, nobody was using this, right? And then it's important to, let's say, still have this, like, what you're actually trying to solve, and like be bold about it and do some iterations and be analytical about it, right? So why are people using this app? Why are people not using this app? What was my hypothesis towards it? And then slowly but steadily, let's say, iterate towards that. And this can take 2, 3, 4 iterations, right? And what usually won't work is you have this great product idea, you develop this product, and oh, it works. So there's going to be 2, 3 iterations, and it's important that you have that in mind. Like, there's no free money, right? So if there's this great idea and you just develop it and that's it, probably somebody would have done it. But it's really about being smart of finding that, and that process is not a 3 months I develop an app. It's a long process, and that's definitely what you have to buy into once you actually want to found a company or build a product, let's say.
Tim, thank you so much for all this wonderful, extremely helpful advice, and all the best going forward for Jodel.
Thank you, Jan. Thanks for the invitation, and yeah, I hope maybe sometime somebody found value in some of the words.
Thanks. All the best.
Cheers. Bye bye.